Section 3. Pranayama, the yogic practice of breathing. Pranayama is the ancient yogic practice of breath control. The Sanskrit word combines prana, meaning life force, the breath of life, or vitality, and ayama, which means to control, lengthen, restrain, or extend. Essentially, pranayama is the practice of extending, controlling, or expanding the breath to increase our energy, health, and vitality through a series of breathing practices that affects both the physical body and the energetic body. Yoga, the philosophy of connection. Before we dive deeper into pranayama, it is helpful to have a brief understanding of how yoga philosophy relates to the breathing practices. One of the most fundamental philosophies of yoga is connection, meaning that the mind, breath, physical body, and energetic body are not separate. More than seeing the self as being connected to itself, yoga views all things in the universe as being interdependent and interconnected. Essentially, all life, nature, animate and inanimate objects, including our thoughts and emotions, affect everything else because of the deep connection that everything shares. Yoga essentially means whole. It describes a state of being that recognizes everything as connected. The reason I use the word whole and not yoke or join, which is the more traditional English translation, is that yoke and join imply two are coming together to form one, as in we start out separate and then join together to become one. But, much like an embryo begins as a single fertilized cell and multiplies into many individual cells that come together to form one human, the many are what make the one. Another way to say it is that we were not constructed from many parts to make a whole. We were whole to begin with. Yoga philosophy refers to the world as being under the veil of Maya. Maya means unreality, fraud, or deceitful trick. Illusion is an easier and maybe a nicer way to say it. For a long time, I thought illusion meant that everything I saw and experienced wasn't real. I would think, how can all this be fake when it feels so real? But illusion doesn't mean that what we see and experience is not real. It just means that reality is not as it appears to us. For example, a good magician performing a trick can fool us into believing that what we're seeing is real. The trick is real, but what we think we are witnessing is different from what is actually happening. Yoga teaches us that reality, as we see it, is like a giant magic trick, a trick so good that the entire world goes on living and believing that what they see is as it is. The trick is that we are separate. The world appears to be made up of billions of separate entities, but yoga says that it is not. We see it as separate because we view the world through the lens of self, the individual, a part of the bigger whole. It is impossible to see anything not as the self or outside of the ego. We are all having a subjective experience, and even if we experience some things objectively, meaning that we are not imprinting our past experiences, preferences, or judgments upon reality as it happens outside of us, those experiences are still perceived as we are, just with the understanding that the objective reality is not as we are. To have a truly objective experience is impossible because experience in itself is subjective. The self creates the illusion of one, and as soon as you identify as one, you have to acknowledge that there are two. This is where the idea of separation comes from. We identify as the self, as a separate entity from other beings, and we create a separation between the self and all other things. The idea of one, or the concept of many, comes from our perspective. We can see ourselves as a whole, complete human, or as a collection of individual cells and microorganisms, as a singularity, or as many things making one thing. Here's a fun way to see it. The human body comprises approximately 37 trillion cells. Every cell has a cell wall separating it from the other cells, a nucleus that acts as its brain, and various other organelles that help it perform its function. Each cell is a part of something bigger, even though it works as a separate entity, performing functions ultimately and altruistically. It performs these functions in order for us to live, move, breathe, eat, and reproduce. On top of the 37 trillion cells that comprise us, it is estimated that we house over 100 trillion bacteria cells that are not us. In fact, our bodies contain more not us than us, yet we don't tend to see ourselves as a collection of separate cells and microorganisms. Compare the trillions of things that make us to the 7.8 billion people living on this planet whom we see as separate from us. But because we are the ones perceiving or having the subjective experience, we can only see ourselves as separate. The ultimate path of yoga is to move past the witness of the self, to realize we are more than the self. We are whole. I don't know if it is possible to transcend the ego to the place where we lose identity of the self entirely and become one with the source. But I know that if we are able to transcend the self will not be able to realize it. There must be an I, or ego, to have the experience of realization. If we transcend the self, the one experiencing, then the one having the experience no longer exists. It's more important to understand that we are all whole, not one whole, just whole, interconnected and interdependent with all of the universe. When we realize this, the individual choices we make will come from the understanding of how everything is affected by our actions. It also helps to understand that separate and different are not the same thing. We can both be different and connected. To be separate is to be disconnected. To be different only implies uniqueness. My thumb is different from my other fingers and still connected to my hand, but if I cut off my thumb, it becomes separate from my hand. I explain this yogic non-dualism concept of connection because it relates to the practice of pranayama in that it helps us understand the much easier concept of the inseparable union between the energetic body and the physical body. As we begin to understand the body better, we can see how the state of our physical body affects how we feel and how the state of our emotional body directly relates to our physical health. An example of this is how stress, a word we often use to describe being unhappy, leads to a weakened immune system, faster aging, and fatigue. It can even cause cancer. The breath is the great link that ties the emotions and the physical body together. Often we can't do much to change our feelings, but we can quickly and easily change the way we breathe, which leads to profound effects, as I will discuss later. The practices in this book affect both the physical and the energetic self, and to fully move towards our intentions through the various exercises, we must focus equally on them both. As we move deeper into the practice of pranayama, we begin to manifest the profound, far-reaching effects that breathing can have in our lives. Slightly changing the breath can affect our mood, attitude, clarity of thought, and well-being. Ultimately, all the practices in this book, regardless of the intention, will lead us to a better place of understanding the self. Pranayama is often linked with meditation, perhaps because many meditation practices have us follow the breath or the sensation of the breath as the object of meditation. Where the breath goes, the mind tends to follow. When we are upset, we often start to breathe fast and heavy. When we are sad, we might sigh deeply. When we panic or are frightened, our breath might become short and choppy. When we are calm, the breath is slow and steady. While pranayama is about controlling the breath, meditation is not about controlling the mind. It is about understanding the tendencies of the mind. It would be nice to think that we are in control of our minds, but if you've ever really tried to control your thoughts, stop your thoughts, or change how you feel, you quickly realize the mind truly has a mind of its own. The mind is like a dog. A well-trained dog makes you believe that you are in control. If you say sit, it sits. If you say stay, it stays. But as soon as another dog or cat runs by, the dog goes after it. Of course, the better trained the dog is, the more obedient it is, and maybe it won't run after everything that it instinctually wants to chase. When we see children and even many adults, we know how the smallest outside stimulus can quickly turn their world upside down. One aggressively chosen finger shown to someone else can quickly change their relaxed demeanor into a fit of rage. Meditation helps train the mind to be less reactive and more active. The better we train the mind, the more control we have over it. And for the things that are outside our ability to avoid reacting to, we have the breath to bring us back. When the breath is unsteady, the mind is unsteady. When the breath is steady, the mind is steady, and the yogi becomes steady. Therefore, one should restrain the breath. Svatmarama, the Hatha Yoga Pradika.